Welcome everyone to today's virtual presentation and Q&A on the gender dimension of digital transnational repression. My name is Emil Dirks. I'm a senior researcher at the Citizen Lab and the moderator for today's event. Apologies in advance, I've got a bit of a cold. Today's event, we're looking at repressive governments and how they use invasive surveillance, online harassment, and defamation campaigns to reach across borders and threaten women activists in exile and diaspora communities. What are the methods and silencing effects of gender-based digital transnational repression? And how can we defend and empower the individuals and communities at risk? Answers to these and other questions are presented in a new report by my colleagues at the Citizen Lab. Published last year in December, the Citizen Lab's report, No Escape, the Weaponization of Gender for the Purposes of Digital Transnational Repression, focuses on the experiences of 85 women human rights defenders and journalists from 24 countries residing in 23 host countries. The report uncovers the weaponization of digital tools used by authoritarian regimes to target exiled women, employing tactics such as online harassment, defamation, and invasive surveillance. These attacks are not only designed to intimidate, but also to silence dissent and undermine democracy. Today, we'll hear from the report's researchers and authors who will present and discuss the report's key findings. We are joined by Siena Anstis, Noura Aljizawi, and Marcus Michaelsen, three senior researchers at the Citizen Lab. We are also joined by Mariam Mirza, a journalist and researcher originally from Iran. For 13 years until 2023, she worked with Deutsche Welle. Since leaving DW, she has served as the head of Iran programs at Net Freedom Pioneers. Mariam was a member of the women's rights movement in Iran, and alongside her work as a journalist, has been consistently engaged in capacity building for Iranian civil society. We also have with us today Arzu Gebola, an Azerbaijani columnist and writer who focuses on digital authoritarianism and its impacts on human rights and press freedom. In 2019, Arzu launched Azerbaijan Internet Watch, a platform that documents and monitors digital information controls and their impacts on civil society in Azerbaijan. We're also privileged to have with us today Dr. Hanna Neumann, who will be delivering today's opening remarks. Dr. Neumann has been a member of the European Parliament since 2019, representing the Greens Europeans Free Alliance. She serves as the spokesperson for foreign and security policy for her group, and in her role as an MEP, she focuses on issues of human rights and security in areas around the world, including the Middle East and Central Asia. Dr. Neumann, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon from Brussels. Good morning to Canada. Thank you so much for this invitation, but even more, thank you so much for shedding light on this very crucial topic. And I mean, Emil, you said it in your introductory remarks, repressive regimes. And I would even go further, democratic regimes with repressive tendencies do not stop their repression at their borders, but they go far beyond with intimidation and harassment all around the world. This kind of transnational repression, so if you do repression not only at home, but you do it across borders and all around the world, it's not a new phenomenon. But if I look at what happened in the last 5 to 10 years, it's a fastly growing phenomenon. We see exiled dissidents, journalists, activists, and their networks, and that's also a very important new dynamic. It's not just going against exiled persons, but it's also going against their support networks, targeted through surveillance, threats, criminalization, silencing. But we've also already seen bomb threats. We have seen murder. It really goes to the full, basically, spectrum of criminal activities that we see. It goes beyond borders. We have this problem inside the European Union, and we see a growing number of countries that employ these techniques, that coordinate, and that learn from each other. I think that's also something we really need to keep in mind. Just to mention a few, because I know we will go more into details. Iran, we know assassination plots, online targeting of women human rights defenders, but all kinds of political activists. Russia, contracted killings, just to name one. China, with the overseas police stations, I think a lot of you have heard from. Rwanda, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, threats of abductions and political assassinations. Eritrea, Venezuela, Belarus, the list is quite long and growing. We also see growing links to organized crime. So, for example, the Iranians hiring Hells Angels to intimidate the Jewish community in Munich, to give you one of these lines of how they are linking with organized crimes in their host countries. And we see, and this is something that we will look at specifically today, a growing presence of transnational repression in the digital sphere. And if I look at what we have seen in the last 5 years, using the tools of digitalization and also artificial intelligence provides them basically with the transnational repression on speed. It's just so much easier. They can target so many more people, and it is so broad in the intimidation, and that really it made this whole thing growing, because now it's not just a few very specific high-level targets, but it's basically targeting whole communities and their networks. And we see that they often deliberately target, especially when it comes to the digital transnational repression, the most vulnerable, women. And they usually don't target only the victim, but they use peer pressure, for example, targeting family members and others to silence the victim, which I think is an especially toxic and cynical form of repression. Why is this known so little? And that's something that bothers me all the time. It's everywhere. When I speak with exiled communities, diaspora communities, everybody tells me about this. And when I speak about here in the European Union, it's just like everybody's having big eyes as if they never heard about it. Well, first of all, I think far too long it has been framed as foreigners doing shitty things to foreigners. So why should we bother? And well, I mean, one thing is, at least a third of people in our countries right now are foreigners. So we should bother because of that. But then in addition, I mean, it's about fundamental rights. It's about protection of human rights. It's about the support networks. And it's just about, can we as the European Union or Canada or the other countries that are still concerned just ensure the safe space that we promise to the people when they come here. And I think we should everything in our means, we should be able to do everything in our means to ensure that safe space. Then transnational repression, different from, for example, anti-Semitism or Islamism or right-wing extremism, is not a specific category of a crime that we're having statistics for, at least in all European Union member states. So you wouldn't even know that something is transnational repression and that the amount of transnational repression is growing, because no one says if there is a crime, it is actually transnational repression. So I really think we need to work on a definition and then to gather statistics so that people actually understand how big the problem is. And then the third aspect is, I know from diaspora communities that there is a huge reluctance to talk to services, to bring these things to their attention. One, because they fear retaliation. So for example, if you tell that to the German police, we will put your sister in Iran into prison. Something that has been said quite often. And the other one is that, of course, a lot of people in the diaspora feel very vulnerable and not safe to now turn to French or Polish or whatnot security services when their asylum process is pending, or when they have in the past made not so nice experiences because the services don't actually understand the problem of transnational repression in the first place. So we're kind of in a vicious circle, downward circle in terms of not reporting because people are not sensitized, because the problem doesn't exist, so people are not reporting, and we are just spiraling downwards, and we really need to break that spiral. As I said, the EU kind of still, and I think that's what we should be, pride ourselves as a safe haven for human rights and human rights defenders, but transnational repression strategically undermines exactly this notion. And it is one of our core tasks to find ways to stop that. And that's why I would like to, first of all, thank all the authors of this study for shedding light to this important piece of the puzzle on transnational repression. And I hope you forgive me, maybe even a bit more to these 85 women that were brave enough to speak up in this study and to share their experiences. And we all know they are just the peak of the iceberg. But without these testimonies and without these stories, it is pretty much impossible for people like me to raise awareness on this issue. So thank you so much for doing that. With the digitalization, I said that in the introduction already, we really see a new quality of systemic attacks on democratic spaces. And we see AI-powered digital repression, which is becoming a core tool of authoritarian regimes. Even I have had very nice videos involving myself in poses that I'm very sure I never took in the first place, but it is just too easy to put words into people's mouths or to put people into context that are very destructive for the reputation, that are very toxic, through the tools of AI. So we see very much more of that. We see a deliberate targeting of women, LGBTQ plus individuals, human rights defenders, often attacking exactly, often involving exactly gender-based violence and reputational attacks. It is like if a man has 3 women, some guy might still celebrate him. If a woman is seen with another guy while she's married, she's basically dead. And they are really using this in very toxic ways. And it leads to diaspora communities, and especially women, paralyzed by chilling effects, mistrust, fragmentation. So sadly, often these repressive regimes are quite successful at the moment because we don't manage to break this spiral and break these patterns, because people are afraid to speak up. So they don't have the lobby, so they are not seen. And this is exactly what they want, is silencing critiques, so that then the political narrative would be, but there are no more people protesting, so it can't be that big, the problem. And I just want to be very clear, transnational repression is not just a human rights issue. It has sadly for a long time been framed as that. For me, it's a matter of European security and democratic resilience, to be very clear. If we can't manage to stop this inside our European Union or inside Canada or whatever national or supranational entity we are talking about, this is our failure, and this is how we should treat it. On the gender dimension, I mean, we know authoritarian regimes are weaponizing gender and sexuality to suppress dissent, not only domestically, but across borders. We've seen that domestically, and here, apologies for referencing the Iranian case again, women being deliberately shot in their face is exactly this gender dimension, and they are basically doing the same thing digitally. We see that a lot of this repression, and I think you will discuss more in the concrete examples, are really based on patriarchal norms and misogyny, and we see intersectionality matters. So if somebody is a woman from the LGBTQ plus community and a person of color, then it hits her 3 times, 4 times. So in the way I'm hit, I'm still very privileged. And you guys that are all nodding, you are even more privileged. The problem is in the EU, we really have a legal patchwork. So we have no unified definition. We have no framework for protection. Transnational repression falls between all competencies, and that's why the response at the moment is reactive and fragmented, and that's what we have to fix. What I will work on, and what I know many of you, we are all working on together. And with this, I come to the conclusion, because I finished, so I conclude, because I was told that my last minute is also over, and I really think we should give floor to those who have participated in the study.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Neumann, for staying to time, but also for your inspiring open remarks and for being such an ally to human rights activists, including women human rights activists, both within the European Union and around the world. So now I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues, Noura and Siena, who will talk about the Citizen Lab's recent research on the gendered dimensions of digital transnational repression. Noura, Siena?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Hannah, for your excellent opening remarks. Can I just confirm that you can see my slides? Perfect. Oh, I'm having technical issues. There we go. Okay, perfect. So I will speak a little bit today about the Citizen Lab's research on digital transnational repression to date, along with my colleague Noura, who will discuss in more depth this recent report titled No Escape, the Weaponization of Gender for Digital Transnational Repression. So my goal is to first provide a bit of an overview of concepts that Hannah so helpfully just described. We define digital transnational repression as situations where countries of origin use digital technologies to silence, persecute, harass, or intimidate dissidents who are living abroad and or in exile. So DTR is an extension of transnational repression, which captures other transnational silencing tactics, such as extradition or extraterritorial killings, which are some of the examples that Hannah mentioned. Freedom House describes DTR as an everyday form of transnational repression because it is so widespread and pervasive. It's also incredibly hard to attribute back to state actors, which makes it even harder to address from a policy perspective and easily adapts to different situations. Different methods are used in undertaking DTR, such as online monitoring of social media, interception and targeted the use of technology like spyware and hacking emails to engage in targeted surveillance against targets, and online harassment, defamation, and disinformation campaigns aimed at human rights defenders and journalists. So the Citizen Lab has published 2 reports so far on digital transnational repression. So for a long time, we've examined digital threats against civil society actors, in particular journalists and human rights defenders. But more recently, in 2019, we started to look at how states extend policies of domestic digital authoritarianism outside their borders and into the borders of other states. So we've been looking more particularly at human rights defenders in exile and how they're impacted by digital technologies. So this led to these 2 reports below. So now we've decided, in the last report, we decided to look more specifically at gender, which was an issue that we saw coming up in our first report, which looked at the impacts of digital transnational repression on individuals living in exile in Canada. So prior research that we did suggested that women were particularly negatively impacted by DTR, and so we've introduced this intersectional approach. So trying to understand how having multiple intersecting identities impacts the gravity of the experiences of those targeted by DTR. So this involves an investigation into understanding the gendered nature of DTR. Are human rights defenders, are women human rights defenders targeted in a specific manner, specific types of language used? How does this differ from male human rights defenders? And I think Hannah really hopefully captured and illustrated some of the specific gender dimensions of DTR, and Noura will get into this in more depth in her presentation. So just as a quick overview, and then I'll hand it over to Noura. So targets countries of origin. This was the second report we did was based on semi-structured interviews with the number of human rights defenders living in exile. So we spoke to 85 research participants who are women, who come from 24 countries of origin. So I think we have quite a broad illustration of how widespread this practice is. And these individuals were living in 23 countries of residence, which suggests that no one in exile is truly safe from the long arm of authoritarianism. So the policies, repressive and authoritarian policies of their countries of origin. And I'll leave that at that for now, and over to Noura, who will discuss in more detail our key findings.
Thank you, Siena. Thank you, Hannah. Siena, you can keep the slides on your device, please. No need to keep switching. I only have 3 slides quickly. So yeah, as Hannah mentioned, like this phenomenon, unfortunately, is not new. However, it's been like manifested in different ways. So like we all know about the practices of authoritarian regimes to repress and harass and intimidate women who dare enough to challenge the patriarchal and authoritarian authorities to engage in the public spaces in their countries. So when it comes to the women in exile, so physically they are not in the reach of these states actors. However, digital technology is making it way easier for these authorities to just digitize the transnational repression. So like through all of our interviews with the brilliant participants, we learn from their experiences so many tactics, and I'm sure like there's not enough space now in this presentation to shed light on all of these tactics and methods of the DTR that they experienced. However, I try to highlight the most significant ones in addition to so many other like endless tactics, unfortunately. Like one of the many very concerning tactics had been mentioned by few participants is the spyware or malware, considering its invasive power, how once it breaks through the device of the targets, it can get access to everything on their data, including their mic, their cameras, etc., etc. And to women in particular, this being very concerning because it's an invasion to their bodies, it's an invasion on their privacy at home. on their family, on their children, as well as on the data of the people and victims back home, or their other co-activists in the movements and grassroots organizations they've been participating in, whether from exile or like some people still back home, they might be subjected to prosecution and imprisonment by the state of origin. Like among of these targets as well, there is the monitoring and surveillance, like these monitorings online for their social media activities, for their online activities, has been making them very anxious about that. Every single click or every single command they can probably make is being recorded, is being and somehow putting in a piece of puzzle that like some point is going to be weaponized against them. There's also the phishing attempts, whether like the attempts to steal their passwords, like their email passwords, as well as taking over their social media accounts. And for sure, there's the online harassment, which is in particular very concerning because it's taking different ways that the online harassment targeting their peer male activists happen. When it comes to targeting women online, the online harassments take gender-based dimensions. It's based on shaming their bodies. It's based on involving the family, because like in patriarchal societies, the woman belongs to the family, unfortunately. So we talk to women who had their families brought up to the discussion, like whether to the harassment campaigns, whether like leaking their wedding photos, shaming the male members of their families because like, yeah, you've been dressing inappropriately, in consideration to the ethical code in their country of origin, or even like bringing up their mothers, their other women from their families as well, and shaming them based on gender means. There's also, unfortunately, women have sometimes like might choose to become mothers. So involving their children who are minor in these attacks is very concerning. We talked to a few women who were whether shamed for not being good mothers because they're involved in activism, or they were threatened that if you don't stop your activism, we're going to hurt your children. So this is what we try to say, that like when it comes to targeting women in exile, it's more complicated, and it's manifested in many different ways than, or more complicated, more devastating ways than targeting men. That being said as well, it's very important to highlight one of the tactics that's being also reported, which is the doxing attacks. When like few of the participants we talked to, they had their personal information leaked on social media, their ID, if they can obtain them, their address, phone number, names of family members as well, including children. And that put them under like psychological pressure, and they felt that they are being left alone because as Hannah mentioned, like most of these other host states, they don't have policies in place, they don't have definition, there's no legislations to flag all of these practices and these online threats targeting these women as crimes, or as something that requires direct intervention by the host state's authorities or direct support to victims. I don't want to talk much about the tactics because like we really need to also shed light on the other phase of these attacks, which is the impacts. The impact is not only technical impact, it's not only about having your account taken over, someone posting something harassing on, please the next slide, Siena. Or something that against your beliefs on your accounts, or breaking through the conversation that you have with people back home, but also about having mental health impacts, physical and impacts on their well-being, relationship. They felt isolated in their communities, and some of them started having negative impacts on their intimate and personal relationship with their partners, as well as with their children. That being said, it's not all about the negative impacts, because, next slide, please, Siena. Many of them remain resilient, and many of them showed this super powerful, inspiring resilience, saying that, like, nothing is gonna stop us. I feel more determined, and for sure, this resilience is not being brought or made by them only because they feel that they are empowered, but because they were privileged to be supported by whether family, solidarity networks, by activists around them or around the globe, support networks, as well as friends and other colleagues in the movements. I just want to conclude with one thought, that when we talk to many of them, we ask just an open question: what does justice mean to you? And a few of them said that this work, having their voices heard, having their stories told, is one step towards justice. So hopefully we can really be brave enough to keep this fight and continue this fight towards justice for all of them. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Noura and Siena for introducing us to your fascinating and, really impactful work that you and your colleagues have produced. I think you've given us a clear sense of the many forms that digital transnational repression can take, but especially the quite disturbing impacts that DTR has on victims, as well as what this means to them and how they've demonstrated resilience in the face of these kinds of attacks. So I'd now like to turn over to Marcus, who will host a brief conversation with the Citizen Labs research fellows who have contributed to this report. This conversation will give us, I think, real insight into how the report was compiled, who are behind these attacks, and how targeted activists have responded. Marcus?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Emil. And thank you also to Siena and Noura for presenting already some of the most important findings of our report. I want to, in this conversation, go a bit into the research process and how we worked on this report. As Siena said, interviews are for us a key method to investigate digital transnational repression. There's documentation in reports of news media and NGOs, but it doesn't capture all incidents because perpetrators try to hide their tactics. And at the same time, you cannot talk to the agents of repression to question them about their tactics and motivations. So interviews with targets is a key method for us to find out more about the different tactics of digital transnational repression and how they impact activists and how these activists cope with these threats. And with these interviews, we also aim to give a voice to activists who these repressive regimes want to silence. And the accounts in our report, the accounts of our respondents provide insights into the human experience actually of online attacks and digital insecurity. And this is something that often gets lost in more technical investigation. We try to maximize our exposure to different viewpoints and experiences by having this global scope of our research. So to collect a large number of interviews from people with different backgrounds, different countries of origin, in order to get a more complete picture of how gender-based digital repression works and affects the targeted activists. And what was incredibly important for this endeavor was the establishment of a fellowship program. We worked with 6 diaspora fellows, we called them, so human rights defenders, journalists, researchers, with a background in 6 different diaspora communities: Iran, Russia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, the Uyghur diaspora, and we had also a research fellow covering different countries in East Africa. And these fellows each conducted 10 interviews. They did country-specific research, and most importantly, they helped us with the analysis and interpretation of our findings. And the program ran over a year. From early on, it became very clear that these 6 fellows had a lot in common. They shared this experience of living outside their country of origin, often a research experience of exile. Several of our fellows had first-hand experience with gender-based online harassment and digital transnational repression. And all this resulted in really fruitful team dynamics with deep conversations and a feeling of trust and solidarity. And so I'm really glad and grateful that 2 of these fellows were able to join us today and talk about their experiences in this project. So we have Mariam, who covered Iran, and Arzu, who worked on Azerbaijan, both countries pertinent perpetrators of transnational repression, including the gender-based variants. So welcome and thank you for taking the time. I have 3 questions on our research. First, starting with the interviews. So when you interviewed activists in exile and in the diaspora about their experiences, can you share a little bit, what did they tell you and what marked you most from these interviews? I will start with Arzu.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you for inviting me to talk about the research. You know, the impact, and I guess what kind of spoke to me the most, having spoken to all of these women, was that obviously they all had different experiences, and they all interpreted what they were going through in different ways. Some kind of didn't really look at it from the perspective of digital transnational repression. They just thought, you know, it was part of the job that they were doing, whether they were human rights defenders or journalists or just political activists, because that's kind of the mindset that, you know, people have within the civil society, at least in Azerbaijan, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in case of Iran and in many other countries that we've covered. And I think what was really what really stood out was just how broad the impact of DTR was on them. You know, some of the women talked about physical impact, kind of feeling afraid physically in the house that they lived in, or feeling afraid when they walk the streets, or feeling concerned about the people that they talk to within the diaspora community. And I think that's also a really important sort of contributor, the consequence of this kind of experience. You know, some of the women were concerned about the safety of their children. You know, Noura was talking about this, especially in the cases of women who did have children, sort of being concerned about what may happen to their children as a result of what they were experiencing online. And of course, there was a lot of conversation about the psychological impact, like the mental health, trying to stay resilient, trying to maintain a position, not just of a person who ended up living in exile, being forced to leave their home country, their friends, their community, being forced to set up a new life in a new country, likely, you know, not speaking the language, likely not having a very closely knit community, all the while kind of keeping their professional hat on, regardless of what they were doing, and maintaining that, you know, balance, which I find is extremely difficult to do all at the same time. And what really marked me the most was, in most of the women that I interviewed, they were still very committed to their jobs, to their professions. They were still very committed to sort of the broader notion of the work that they were doing. They really believed that, you know, journalism is really important, and continuing to tell stories about what's happening in Azerbaijan is really important, or advocating for human rights and freedom of expression is really important. And so none of them really talked about kind of taking a step back, or taking a break, or considering completely changing their fields in the long term, because that was still kind of, you know, their main affiliation and their main commitment. And so I think I would wrap it up here, but those were some of the highlights that really kind of spoke to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, Mariam, what were your impressions and
Yeah.
highlights from the interview?
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Arzu. Just what I want to add is, as we know, there are different kind of digital attacks, and when it comes to Iran, the defamation attacks, smear campaigns are kind of dominant, and they are very damaging for these activists. And so for me, from someone who was, before doing this research, being part of all social media platforms and being kind of in relation with these activists, always, I used to think that it's obvious. No one believes it, that it is like, for example, they are terrorists, or they have some, like, I don't know, collaboration with terrorist groups. But when you talk to these women, you see that they tell you that even baseless accusations, when they are persistent, when they are going on and on wherever if it is Twitter or X or Instagram, they are repeating these accusations against these women. After some time, unfortunately, not only the user, general users, also the other activists, the civil society activists and other activists start believing these accusations about one another, each other. So this is very damaging for activists, and they put so much energy on sometimes explaining themselves to other activists, and also feeling kind of like ashamed of what is there against them. And also what I hear the most is these activists are not feeling safe in the host countries. Also, like we were talking about, Hannah was referring to, like, seeing these activists as foreigners, that other foreigners are doing something against them. But for me, it's very interesting, because most of these activists, at least the activists I talk to them, are now citizens of European countries, citizen of the US, citizen of Canada. And so for me, it's like very wrong. But when it comes to us, it's not just we are in exile, also we are citizen of these countries, and still we are being kind of like labeled as foreigners when it comes to these kind of very fundamental issues that in the end will affect the countries that we are living in too, not just ourselves. This was something else that they really don't feel safe. And another thing that I want to bring it up here is also this experience of digital attack is kind of a shared experience. Like every activist you talk to is kind of has experienced digital attack in any form, if it is hacking, phishing, or defamation attack, hate attack. But still, it is kind of like they feel lonely about these attacks. They are not connected. They are not connected, and they are not, even if they talk to each other, it's not, I am going to talk to another activist because she is also an activist. They are talking to each other because they are friends. If they are not friends, they don't talk to each other because the other person is an activist too. So for me, it was very hard to hear, and bitter to hear how lonely and isolated they feel when it comes to talking about these attacks. Even sometimes they're not able to talk to very close friends because they are afraid that they will be afraid, and they won't stop their connection, their relationship with them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, we always talk about the regimes as a somehow anonymous entity. But if we go more into detail, so who do you see as the key actors or key perpetrators responsible for engaging in these types of threats and attacks? And what do you think is their motivation and their aim? Azu, if you want.
I mean, I think in the case of the women, at least for all the women that we've interviewed in this research from across all of the different countries, the involvement of the state and its various sort of tentacles was very kind of visible across the research, across the countries that we looked at. Again, in the case of Azerbaijan, I can say that women who were interviewed talked about trolls. They talked a lot about the bot accounts as well. Some of the women I interviewed were journalists who, including myself actually, who looked into who these trolls are at some point in time, because this is not a new phenomenon. The existence of the deployment of trolls to sort of target journalists and rights defenders and activists has been in practice for a really long time in Azerbaijan. And so we've grown sort of accustomed to their existence and how they're being used to criticize everything that is ever posted by any critic of the regime. And it's not just a criticism. Sometimes that criticism is copy-paste. So you know very clearly that it's sort of organized and orchestrated. Sometimes it's very personal. There's very sort of visible and strong verbal reaction, which includes, you know, swear words, or it can include things like things like questioning your profession as a credible journalist or as an activist, et cetera, et cetera. So the deployment of trolls and the existence of bot accounts, and of course how the governments using these tools are actually relying heavily on the platforms, because that's where a lot of this sort of a lot of these attacks occur. Social media platforms are quite crucial for Azerbaijan civil society in exile and within the country, or at least the remaining civil society actors who are still in the country, because much of the independent media has been censored and there are no other avenues given the crackdown against non-governmental organizations, imprisonments, political persecutions and whatnot. And so social media is kind of the only available stage for anyone involved in this kind of work to not only, you know, voice a criticism, but actually share the work that they do, whether it's research, whether it's a news story, or, you know, a case that they're advocating for, and so on and so forth. And the lack of oversight on these platforms makes it very easy for autocratic regimes that deploy these kind of tools, because it becomes this like a vicious circle of them complaining to the platform not taking enough measures to protect the complaints, the recipients of the targeting, and in between the time that it has been spent, there are more attacks and there's more targeting, or when your content is being taken down for no reason, and because platforms don't know the context, they take down the channel, or they take down the content, and they comply with these requests. So that makes it really difficult. And I think, you know, it's not just the sort of non-real actors. There are also real people who do come after women, who do come after critics in exile. And these are the kind of people who are either on a government payroll, or they work for government institutions, or they've been hired, or they represent various sort of movements that are meant to look like they're independent, but they actually not. They are representative of the government, of the authorities. And those individuals get away with what they do. They get away with targeting women by tarnishing their reputation. They get away with harassing them. They get away with exposing their personal information online. They get away with all kinds of tactics that Noura was highlighting in her intervention earlier. And so it becomes a problem that we talk about, at least we've been like documenting it and talking about it, but it still remains a problem that we can't really tackle because of so many different facets and points that go into the DTR, and the actors involved and the actors responsible. And we haven't really come to a unified way of dealing with all these different sort of influencers in the process.
Yeah, thank you. Mariam, what's your view on the perpetrator?
Yeah, regarding Iran, whoever I interviewed and whoever I talked to believes that the Iranian regime is behind of, if we don't say all of these attacks, but most of the attacks. So, and what they are looking for is, of course, intimidation and silence of these women. They want to them, if they cannot put them in the prison, they force them either leave these spaces, online spaces, or they be silent. So for me, but what I heard also is like when it comes to women, is not just the regime. Some parts of the opposition of regime, unfortunately, with misogynistic views, also time to time joins the attacks that they are engineered, and the source goes back to the regime of Iran, but the opposition, because part of the opposition with misogynistic views, because they don't like these women or the way that they are kind of self-expressing themselves, so they join the attack. And also not just these groups, also any individual who doesn't like, who hates women, basically, or trans women, or they have a bad history with this or that activist, they basically join these attacks, and they don't care. For example, if there is a piece of information that you can be sure that the source of the information online cannot be anywhere than the regime, because the information is something that it can just come from inside Iran, from the regime and cyber army. But still, the other actors use this information, regardless that the source is from the regime of Iran against these activists. For example, the father of these activists used to be very religious, or used to be a mullah in Iran. Like, they use these information that it has been published by the regime. So when it comes to women, we see that all these actors, unfortunately, join the attack that Iranian regime has designed against one activist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mariam and Arzu. So being conscious of time, I will leave the final question on resistance and support mechanisms for the Q&A. I'm sure this question will come up, and I will hand back to Emil.
Well, thank you very much to Marcus and Mariam and Arzu. As we heard, these threats are happening on platforms, on digital platforms, the kind that you and I or everyone in the audience probably uses in our day-to-day lives. So while perpetrating states are the primary culprits behind digital transnational repression, we also know that platforms and host states can play key roles in responding to or addressing and in sometimes perpetrating these kinds of attacks. Noura and Siena, could you tell us a bit more about the role that host states and platforms play in digital transnational repression?
I'll speak a little bit about the role of host states in responding to digital transnational repression. So I think actually something that Hannah said earlier caught my attention, and I think it's still very important that host states conceptualize transnational oppression and its digital components as human rights violations, because this should, in theory, trigger certain obligations on host states to take action to prevent and protect against these rights violations from happening. So it's not just an issue of national security and protecting, for example, different state institutions of the host state, but I think is primarily about protecting the rights of persons who are being silenced in this manner. But then everything Hannah said about sort of the gaps and issues in addressing transnational oppression and digital transnational oppression are was so well summarized. So I hesitate, I'll be repeating a little bit of what she said, and then I think we'll discuss a bit more in recommendations. as we close the webinar. So one of the overarching issues that I think we've seen in our research has been this lack of a definition or understanding of transnational oppression and digital transnational oppression among host state institutions. And this creates like a series of complications. For example, law enforcement, when confronted with when someone raises a complaint about something happening to them that falls within the scope of transnational oppression or digital transnational oppression, may be in a position where they don't understand the full repercussions or the context within which this complaint is being made, and then fail to take action or unable to take the right type of action. So it's important that we have clear definitions that can then be understood and institutionalized across different host state institutions and agencies. Yeah, and so I think that's the main issue that I want to raise today, is that host states, I think, are still in this period of transition where they're starting to come to grips with this activity, transnational oppression and digital transnational oppression, that has honestly long been undertaken by authoritarian and other states. And there's a real urgency now to define it and then to streamline and sort of coordinate responses across agencies so that when people raise this issue, it doesn't fall within significant gaps, because one agency says, for example, no, that's actually the responsibility of another, and then victims are left with absolutely no assistance. And I think in doing this, it's helpful for host states to think about their obligations under international human rights and regional human rights law. For example, when it comes to extraterritorial killings, there are very clear positive steps or positive obligations that states have to take to prevent such killings. For example, even an obligation to warn targets when certain requirements are met, to undertake independent investigations. So extraterritorial killings that are fall within the scope of transnational oppression, so have this purpose of silencing the victim, cannot be treated as a political issue that is then dealt with through the back channels of a diplomatic response, but need to be investigated in a manner that meets the requirements of international human rights law. And the public has a right, I think, to understand the steps that states are taking in undertaking such investigations and addressing transnational oppression and digital transnational oppression more broadly. So I'll leave it at that, because I think we want to save some time for more discussion regarding next steps. And I'll hand it over to Noura, who will speak a bit more about social media platforms.
Thank you, Siena. Yeah, one of the, unfortunately, main actors in digital transnational repression is the platforms. Activists in exile, they need to be connected. They need to talk to people on platforms that they use. And it's not in many discussions, like when there's the recommendation to activists use end-to-end encrypted applications, but what about telling people what you're doing, and what about talking to people on platforms that are really available in the country of origin? So as Miriam and Arzu mentioned, some platforms are censored in certain countries. So this is the very hard trade that activists in exile, they need to take, because they cannot just isolate themselves and stay disconnected in order to protect themselves. So while we were working on this research, we also reviewed certain selected platforms policies, and we found it's very disturbing that there's nothing explicitly mentioning digital transnational repression. However, there are some elements of the practices of digital transnational repression, and the tactics are addressed in the guidelines of some of these platforms, including X and Meta. But when it comes to the enforcement of these guidelines, we found there's nothing really reliable to support victims or to be responsive on times. And this is including doxing, disinformation, coordinated inauthentic behaviors, and the harassment, gender-based harassment, including the harassment of women and LGBTQ people. I guess the dilemma that whenever we talk about platforms, there is this huge dilemma about the content moderation. like one of the criticisms for sure about content moderation, which is about the automation of content moderation and how the how the training of these models to moderate the content is like lacks the context, lacks the cultural aspects of this of certain communities and certain languages. And I believe the very disturbing figures came, or the platforms had to reveal under the DSA, Digital Security Act, are very disturbing because, like, although the immigrants and diaspora populations from around the world are not few. However, the number of moderators in the EU, for instance, we don't have data about the other democratic countries. We don't have data about Canada, for instance, or the United States. We only have data about content moderators in the EU. So when we reviewed the number of moderators, the humans who really can address, if there is willing, can address the complexity of certain threats online, they are not that much. Like for Arabic, for instance, X has only 4 or 5, I'm not quite sure, but like it's very only few people in consideration to all the campaigns, the disinformation campaigns, the hate speech, the online attacks that are happening in Arabic, targeting people based in the European Union. So it's not enough to address this. And on top of that, to make things even worse, in like Meta and X, for instance, they time it up with the elections, re-election of President Trump, and they change the policies, allowing, quote unquote, more freedom of speech on platforms. So now on platforms, vulnerable communities who are like every single identity that intersects to make the victims and the targets of digital transnational repression, in particular women and LGBTQ people. So now these platforms are open for hate speech under the name of freedom of expression, open for hate speech targeting refugees and immigrants, women, the sexuality of women and the sexuality of LGBTQ people, as well as so many other categories of vulnerable communities. So allowing this dehumanization, allowing these hate speech targeting these people is for sure gonna increase the level of online threats as well, because as everyone before, in particular Arzu, Miriam, and Siena, they mentioned that there's a very blurry line between the online and offline threats that these people we talk to are experiencing. And even when there is something about like reporting, there's guideline, there's a reporting system. But let's talk about the reporting system. It's not designed to support or to be friendly for victims. It's very traumatizing. Victims of these attacks, they have to scroll down all the posts, take screenshots, and report on them. They have to upload. So even like these platforms, when they have mechanisms in place, the burden is on targets. The burden is on victims who are not equipped, who are experiencing the trauma firsthand, who are going all of these troubles in their online and offline lives. But they have to report, they have to take screenshots. And sorry, I remember one of the participants mentioned that, like, when they were reporting the deep fake content on certain platform, they were asked to prove that these contents were created by state actors. So even the attribution, which is very sophisticated, even for the most equipped researchers, is also being put as a burden on victims themselves. So this is only a snapshot of the lives of when targets who are being harassed on certain platforms. And for sure, there are so many other incidents that platforms and tech companies more broadly are failing the targets of digital transnational repression. I'm told that my time is over, so I will hand it over to Emil. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Siena and Noura for those remarks. Now we've moved into the Q&A session. So I have a few questions that I'd like to direct to the panelists, but I'd also encourage the audience, if you have questions, to send them in, and I will do my best to compile them and see how many we can get through before the end of the session over the next half hour. So I'd like to turn our attention back to Dr. Neumann, who introduced or began the session today. Dr. Neumann, could you talk a bit about the EU's policies or the policy response of the EU regarding DTR? So what is the European Union doing now to combat digital transnational repression? And what is the EU doing to safeguard exiled human rights defenders who are living in the EU?
Well, I think I can exactly take off where I stopped my introductory remarks, saying that we have a patchwork of frameworks and regulations that in one way or another could help with transnational repression. But it's not that someone looked at it from, oh, we have a problem with transnational repression, what can we do to fix it? A few words have been said, for example, on the digital platforms, where we now have the Digital Services Act, where we now in theory have rules and regulation, for example, for hate speech or lies to be taken off. The experiences, I wouldn't even say they are mixed. From a user side, it's highly problematic. We heard the description of what a user has to do. And then in the end, most of the time, it's like, we are sorry, no violation has been found. Yet it still puts some pressure on the companies to at least that they know they are in charge of this. So I think on the digital one and with the Digital Service Act and others, we have to force them more to fully implement and to take more victim-centered approach rather than a platform-centered approach, which is what they are, or a technic-centered approach, which is what they do right now. I also think it's cumbersome that we have a lot of protection programs for human rights defenders abroad, such as Protect Defenders, where they would be given training on digital security, where in kind of doxing or other attacks, they are given support. But the moment they kind of go into exile, these programs stop because they are for human rights and human rights defenders, and that's abroad. But when it comes to fundamental rights, how we call human rights internally, we don't have these programs. And here I'm trying to create at the moment awareness and see how we can support victims. I mean, we also have a lot of domestic human rights defenders. Just think about the whole spyware debate that are left largely alone with these kinds of problems. So here we really have a gap, and that's something I think we need to fill. And it doesn't make sense that we have 27 different mechanisms, because those that undermine our security with transnational repression, they are working together and they ignore European borders. I know that Canada is trying to do a lot in the context of their G7 presidency. We also had some initial initiatives from the Europarat, or whatever that is, from the European Council, Council of Europe. So I think we have some first initiatives, but it's about time from a victim-centered approach, and that would be for me the most important. So what is it that victims need to really close these loopholes? And it all starts with acknowledging there is transnational repression, we have a problem, that's the definition, and make it easier for victims to report.
No, thank you for that. Yes, definitely the reporting mechanisms. This seems to be one of the major issues that are facing victims, be they in the European Union or Canada or other countries. I'd like to take this opportunity now to direct our attention back to Miriam and Arzu. Both of you, in a sense, wear two hats. You're both fellows who are conducting research on gender-based transnational repression. You're both experts on this topic. At the same time, you are both activists, researchers who are working in exile. So could you tell us a bit about your experience doing this, working on this project, and maybe what it was like to balance those two particular roles?
I can speak. For me, exactly because of my background and working and being in contact with activists all the time, when I started working on this research, for me, it was like I know everything. I was feeling like, okay, I ask questions, but I know already everything myself. But for me, it was very interesting when interesting, but unfortunately, it was like there was a lot of things I didn't know. And the scale of the attacks was completely something that I could not imagine. And also their profound impact that it had on people that even I know them, but never we talked about this. So when you talk to activists, the activists that you're already in contact with them, still it's very shocking for you that is going on. And there is this dominant silence. Even people who are talking, it is just like, for example, Masih Alinejad, or those activists that they are going to the court, they're going to the media, still it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's not like, it doesn't cover what is going completely like on the everyday life of the activists. So, and the solutions these activists are finding for themselves is a mix of different things. Like some of them have the support from the families, some of them don't have. But what you see, most of them are isolating themselves. Most of them are because these attacks, digital attacks, are tied to like physical threats, physical real threats. So many of them are isolating themselves from Iranian community. So they are not only in exile, they are in exile, in again, double exile, because they don't go to the community. For example, Nowruz celebration, or these kind of celebrations that you can feel kind of at home if you are with the community, but they take themselves outside, they take themselves back. So because they are very concerned. Also for me, it was very interesting to remember that Iran is very diverse, because I am from Tehran. I know most of the activists who are Fars. So I was interviewing an activist who is Arab, and I was saying that how different is, and even how more complicated is the situation is for her. So for me, it's like this research reminded me, also helped me to understand better what all these activists that they are living even around me are going through, and how it means and how it feels to be a target online.
I mean, there's so many parallels in the answers that Mariam shared with you. I think in my case, you know, being the person who is doing the research, having been affected by DTR myself, and kind of, you know, which is what I was just thinking as Mariam was speaking, you know, this is why I ended up living in exile. Even though I was living abroad at the time, it was the targeted harassment that I went through back in 2014 that kind of led me to where I am now. I'm coming to terms with the fact that that's it. I will not be going back to Azerbaijan anytime soon. And this is kind of the new reality of my life. And so, you know, with that experience, going into this work was, I guess, you know, I felt prepared, because it takes a certain amount of sort of psychological and mental preparedness to hear women share stories and their experiences. And in many ways, it also made it more a candid conversation. A lot of the women I got to speak with, they already knew me. Either they knew my story or they knew me personally. And with some of them, I already was friends with. And so it almost felt like we were having a friendly conversation, just kind of going over and really kind of diving really deep into some of the examples that they were bringing up, just because we felt that level of comfort and sort of safety to really share what was going on. In many ways, I share also what Mariam was saying about this sheer impact on the women, especially in terms of their place in diaspora community, because, you know, being in exile and being in exile is one thing, but then being in exile and being part of diaspora community, it's a whole other level, because it takes a lot of energy to engage with that community, to kind of keep ties. And sometimes it's really hard to be in that mindset when your name is all over media back in your country, where people are discussing your body, where you're being targeted on Telegram channels and whatnot, and yet you have to put on a smile and be in the space where you have elderly people and you have to be very disrespectful, and you kind of hope that they don't really know what's going on in your life or how you're being exposed in your country of origin. And so I think that also adds an additional toll, like hearing this kind of experience of women actually choosing not to be part of the diaspora community, just because they didn't want to be, you know, facing an additional line of questions about, really, is that what's happening to you? Or really, have you really done this and that? But also a point about safety. Diaspora communities, especially Azerbaijani diaspora communities, are never really entirely 100% proof or have, you know, been checked. You never know who is reporting for whom. Someone may be spying on you, maybe someone may be, you know, collecting information on you, and so that's also a reason to kind of stay away and distance yourself. But overall, I can just say that, you know, for me personally, it was really important to not only be the one who always kind of talks about my own experience, but bring in the experiences of so many other women from Azerbaijan who have had similar experiences, and really just add to the breadth of knowledge and the research that we've been doing, hopefully for this to advance better accountability measures that we can eventually come up with to deal with DTR.
No, thank you for that. And I think the word used there, accountability, is really pertinent, kind of links well to the next question I have, which is to Noura, Siena, and Marcus, which is thinking about recommendations, responses to digital transnational repression, and specifically to gender-based digital transnational repression. So do we have a sense about what kind of policy responses have worked, be they in the European Union or Canada or the United States or elsewhere? And then beyond that, what still is needed to be done? Opening up to whoever wants to take a first shot at this very big, very loaded question.
Okay. Yeah, if you allow, then I will. I think in terms of what works or what is important, I can pick one aspect. So what came up in all interviews was that these activists and journalists, they always needed one trusted contact where they could turn to with questions of with regards to digital security. So is this safe? Can I do this? What do I do with this type of message? Or so they needed this peer support and advice, and this was very important, and to have also this these response mechanisms in times of digital security emergencies. And I think these mechanisms, they are in place already, and they work well, but they work on they don't reach all targets. So there are people at the margins who don't have access to these rapid response mechanisms and who are without digital support. So this is one aspect that we need to work on, and yeah, we definitely, I think this needs also more funding from governments and technical expertise from the private cybersecurity sector, information sharing on emerging threats. This is one aspect that should be further developed to better protect these communities.
Yeah, Noura or Siena, anything you'd like to add or build upon that Marcus said? Well, if not, we do have a question. Oh,
I can.
oh, go ahead. No, please.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, for sure. I agree with Marcus on everything he said, but I would like also to invite all actors and host states to think about how to protect targets. It's not only about, like, I always get upset when I see, for instance, the Canadian politicians here keep blaming China and Iran and Russia for targeting activists and defenders in diaspora. But then, like, at the end of the day, what are you really doing to support these targets? What are you really doing to support the human rights defenders and women rights defenders? We know that, like, democratic states, not all of them, some of them are retreating their policies, but many of them, they have policies, feminist policies. They have policies in place to integrate and empower women to participate meaningfully in peace and security. They have all of this agenda in place. But then, like, how are you supporting these women? Unfortunately, since we started this research, and like we've been constantly hearing about women who are fighting patriarchy, authoritarianism, and all kinds of discrimination around them for their activism, whether like they choose to participate in peace talks or peacemaking or journalism, but then like they become targets. And when it comes to their roots in their host states, or where they're trying to build a new lives, hoping to continue the work that they started, they find that this ground under them is not stable. Many of them have been reporting to us that they are being targets of the authorities of the host states, of the agencies, whether being interrogated under this aspect of your activism. Who are the people you've been working with? Why a journalist would be interrogated for her investigative work in a war zone by the security agency? And all of these questions, like many of them have been having this sense that whether they need really to talk to the authorities of states about whatever is happening to them, or questioning that if host states, authorities, and governments are safe, or is it really going to make them a target again? So these are like very big questions. And again, like all of these mistrust between the activists in host countries and the authorities and the government is making the lives of these activists even harder. Few of them that we talk to are having troubles with their whether refugee claims or even with their permanent residency applications. And for what? It's very easy, it's very simple to investigate, as long as we have really the sense and responsibility of protecting these people, of naming and shaming and blaming the perpetrators, and instead of the tokenism of blaming China and Russia and Iran in statements, just walk towards some actions, get responsibility, and do your job to protect these people and to make sure that democracy is protected, not only in terms of the statements and in terms of making a super inspiring campaign for elections, in terms of making it real, starting from here, starting internally, protect activists who are defending democracy, not only in these countries, but also contributing to the greater causes to defend democracies in other countries around the world.
Can I just add quickly to that? I think one of the, well, this connects, I think, with what Marcus said at the ending, and then what Noura has well explained. I think one big issue is information sharing between states and human rights defenders, civil society organizations. So I think right now, like, it's very clear that states have the capacity, host states have the capacity to collect and analyze significant amounts of information about digital transnational repression or digital attacks against individuals within their territory jurisdiction. What information that human rights defenders or civil society organizations then hear, I think, is very limited. It's very unclear. So I think there's a big need to sort of reform and better and set certain standards and a framework for information sharing between host states and human rights defenders, because there's just no way that, you know, that human rights defenders, whether individually or within their communities, are able to access the same information, right, or able to understand the threats that they face. And I think states have been very, have sort of kept this information very close to them. So I think that will be a big area for, well, a very contentious area already, so we'll see how much change happens. But I think that's something that's quite critical that needs to happen if we're going to appropriately respond to transnational repression.
No, thank you for those very incisive answers. So we have a question from the audience. Someone notes that the doxing, specifically of feminist activists in Argentina, has become quite a big problem there. Have you worked with cases that from Argentina or maybe South America in general? And then maybe building off of that, have you noticed any differences in terms of either the kinds of digital transnational repressive tactics used by particular countries or the difference in the kind of content of those attacks between cases? And I'll open this up to whoever would like to respond. Noura?
Yeah, I can take it quickly. Like, unfortunately, we didn't get chance to recruit participants from Argentina. However, from South America, we interviewed participants from Venezuela, Cuba, and Guatemala. We know that for sure in South America, like in Central and South America, there are like all of these new emerging campaigns of digital transnational repression. So I believe like it's something that we might consider to investigate more in the future. But we know that unfortunately, whatever is happening domestically as forms of gender-based authoritarian harassment to women and feminist activists in particular is following them across the borders when they flee the countries.
So maybe actually building off of this, talking about the different cases, another question from the audience notes that there's a real reluctance on the part of victims to share experiences of transnational repression that they've faced, be it with law enforcement, or, the government, maybe even members of their own community. So this audience member is wondering, what kind of challenges did all of you have to navigate when it came to actually finding individuals who were willing to participate in this study?
I can, or maybe Marcus, go ahead.
No.
I mean, in terms of finding women in Azerbaijan or Azerbaijani women living in exile, it wasn't really hard because the exiled community is quite small, and the number of women within the exiled community is even smaller. And as Mariam was mentioning in her earlier intervention, often we all know each other. Either because we worked together in the past or we just simply kind of do similar work or have been doing similar work. And so in this particular case, it wasn't, I think what was harder was to actually explain what the research was about, really kind of laying out what digital transnational repression means, what different types of digital transnational repression there are out there, and kind of finding where their experience really fit in this research. But I think it was kind of also an informative experience for the women I got to talk to as well, because they got to learn a little bit more, or actually learn how to really define what was happening to them through the lens of DTR.
Also, I would like to add that about Iranian community, as Arzu mentioned, it's not a very small community, exile community, but still we know each other. And I think one of the good things about our team was like we were working with our own communities and most of us had connections. So because the trust was very important for our interviews. So if I didn't know someone myself, there was someone who knew me well, could introduce me so that the other person would trust me fully, because I had one interview among all of them that I felt like there was the trust didn't have the chance to kind of form, and so she was there. I interviewed her, but still I could feel the distance. So the chance we had, I think all of us, was like we knew most of them personally, or someone who knew us well put us in contact, and then this trust helped us a lot.
No, that's very helpful to hear, and it does sound like really the core to this work was building up or building off of real relationships of trust that already existed, and demonstrating that you all as researchers, as experts, were worthy of that trust. So we've got a few more minutes, and I do want to kind of throw out a really big question that is always on my mind, which is, again, apologies that this is a big one. We won't be able to cover all of it, but what do you think the impact of the new Trump administration will have in terms of combating digital transnational repression? is the Trump administration, or will the Trump administration make actually dealing with these problems, say holding perpetrators to account or providing support for victims or impacted communities, more difficult? And if so, why? Again, opening it up to whoever'd like to answer in the next 3 to 4 minutes.
Yeah, I will be very short. I certainly think that it's going to make our lives much more difficult, because all of that, according to Trump, is covered by freedom of speech. And one is that it is actually not a proper behavior, and it's not legal, and it's not covered by freedom of speech. It's something that now we need to kind of rediscuss again before we get the full spectrum of political parties on board to actually fight it. And I'm afraid this will make our lives much more difficult, including that a lot of platforms will contest that it's actually their job to stop it. And just every stupid, misogynist idiot feels emboldened, but that's a general problem.
Yes. Yeah, Marian.
Sorry. I also wanted to add that Trump administration has defined women, gender, so many words, even kind of like that. We don't tolerate them. We don't want to hear it. So when we were working on this research, it feels now like it's history, like far history, because now when we want to talk to host countries, what they can do for the activists, like digital, gender-based digital transnational repression, we need to talk about gender. We cannot not talk about gender, or we cannot say, okay, we are working with women, but we don't mention the word of women. So for me, it's like now, even about the wording, we don't know how to talk with, if it comes to the funds, American funds, if it comes to talking to different stakeholders in the US, it is really hard to speak to them.
Marcus, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think the problem is that a lot of resources that the US government has are now withheld or are missing to coordinate and support responses to DTR and transnational repression more broadly. So in terms of financial resources, but also intelligence and expertise on in this field. So just there are so many organizations now affected by these budget cuts, from the Open Technology Fund that is working on technical countermeasures to censorship and surveillance, to many China-related organizations or human rights organizations who can now no longer work in this field. And this only tells us that maybe during that time, the European Union and the UK have to step up and fill this gap and work on countermeasures and take the initiative that is now missing from the US side.
Well, I think that's a good place to maybe end things on. I want to just sort of stress that, Noura, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to mention that it's very disturbing to see that the same tactics that have been used in digital transnational repression, many of them are being used now in the crackdown on many of the populations that we've been talking to, who are whether refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, LGBTQ people, human rights defenders, women. So all of these disturbing reports about the FBI and ICE are purchasing spyware. We are calling out the authoritarian regimes for their misuse of spyware targeting these populations. And we are calling out the authoritarian regimes and the countries of origin for their misuse of social media surveillance and using social media and these platforms and technology more broadly to harass, intimidate, and silence the activists. But now the United States as a host state is unfortunately adopting the same tactics of these authoritarian states and targeting the same population. So this is very disturbing. This is very concerning, because now many people in the domain are asking themselves, like, can we really trust the agencies to report to them whatever we are experiencing from other states, or is it going to make us even a target? If ICE forgot about us or didn't notice us yet, we are not on their radar yet for deportation or harassment, is probably our countries of origin using these technologies against us is making us probably more visible for these kinds of targeting.
Well, it's a rather grim note to end the report end our webinar on, but I think an accurate and good reflection on the current moment. Times are fairly dark. I think what the report and certainly what our discussion today emphasizes that these threats are borderless, but also solidarity can be borderless as well. And I think what we've heard today is that not just platforms and governments, but even individuals, people within and outside impacted communities, we can all play a role in combating digital transnational oppression. So I want to thank everyone today, Dr. Neumann, Arzu, Mariam, Noura, Siena, Marcus, for joining us today and for sharing all of your really fascinating, impactful, and necessary work. I'd like to encourage the audience to read the report as well as the previous report that the team has written on digital transnational oppression. And finally, I'd like to thank all of our audience members for your wonderful questions and for your participation and for demonstrating a real interest in this again, quite fascinating, but quite frankly disturbing topic. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone and wish everyone a pleasant day wherever in the world you may find yourself. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.